Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Mangoes and Cream Natural Processed Ethiopia from Talormade. And there's the box right there. And Talormade, based out of Oslo, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel multiple times before. And anytime I do see their coffee at a coffee shop, I immediately take a look through their offerings, as they're known to have some more unique and interesting coffees. Now this time we played it safe by going with a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, given that we've never reviewed any of their Ethiopian coffees. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turns out, as this right here is day 32. And recipe we went with for this coffee is our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this coffee, I usually say it's tricky to tell when it comes to natural processed coffees, but this one wasn't tricky whatsoever, as this was a very light coffee, very much in line with the term true Nordic light, as right from the start, you could definitely tell that this was a very light coffee. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and the first thing I noticed from the cup was a very strong graining quality. And again, that's something I experienced with some very light roasted coffees in general, but that really seemed to dominate a lot of the first impression within this cup, as there was some additional sweetness as well as a stone fruit forward aspect that was a little bit more in the sugary direction to kind of contrast that graininess, but the graininess remained present throughout the entire duration of this first impression. Moderate brightness, so for the most part, it left an okay first impression. On day 16, ran it through the Chemex, and the cup was coming out slightly more clean with a little bit more of the listed creaminess present, as I could feel a little bit more of that vanilla attribute present on this day. A slightly sweeter cup to kind of contrast a little less of the graininess present within it, and a more bright yellow fruit, so a little bit better of a second impression. Day 18, ran it through the April dripper, and it's the best it had been of this coffee to this point, and I probably would have persisted with the April dripper had I had more filters, but there's noticeably less of the graininess and a little bit more of the clean tropical fruit forward aspects within this coffee. Listed creaminess also felt a little bit more apt, as the entire cup just felt a lot more balanced through this brew method, as the previous brew methods did seem to skew it a lot more in the unclean grainy aspect. Day 21, another try through the V60 with higher temperatures and a little bit more fine of a grind, and it continued to have a lot more of that graining quality, even more so than it had in the previous days, as it felt like it was getting a lot more vibrant in that direction. Tropical fruits quite pronounced present yet again, and it felt like a lot of the natural processed Ethiopian berry characteristics present within the coffee as it did cool down as well. Not necessarily my favorite today. We continue with this coffee through day 23, as we ran it through the Chemex, and it felt slightly light and lacking, as there wasn't as much of the vibrant tropical fruit components present within it on this day. Slight bit of brightness and citric component on the back end to kind of contrast the graininess, but the graininess still continues to dominate this cup. So still kind of struggling with this one, as this one's been consistent in not necessarily the best way. Day 25, even higher temperatures and a more fine grind continues to yield a pretty bright tropicality, but there's still a lot of the natural berry aspects present within this coffee. So I did try. I know a lot of people really like pushing the extraction, going really high in the temperatures and going really fine on the grind, and it didn't really seem to help this coffee, as it didn't come out overly clean, but it was a little bit more sweet and vibrant. So I guess the trade-off could be worth it to some people, but the lack of clarity really wasn't necessarily doing it for me. Pretty tricky cup. It just felt like the adjustments were kind of skewing it in a direction that I didn't necessarily enjoy. Day 27, for better or worse, the coffee continues to remain consistent, as I opted for the Chemex this time, and there was slightly less of the vibrancy yet again. That's the reason I didn't necessarily enjoy the Chemex, was the trade-off wasn't really worth it. At this point, I wasn't getting a lot of fruit vibrancy from running it with this brew method. It does still maintain plenty of body and texture with a little bit of the brightness and fruitiness within the cup, but I said, I'll stomach the graininess I'm not necessarily enjoying if it means getting a little bit more of the fruit vibrancy, even more of the body, and even a little bit more of the brightness, because at least I have some things to contrast the graininess. Day 29, best day of the coffee to this point, as there was a lot more clarity, and I feel like this is another one of those coffees where if you just continue to let it rest for a longer period of time, here on day 32, it's a little better. I feel like maybe giving it another week and letting a lot of this coffee kind of settle down, you might get a lot less of the graininess because it does feel like it's dying down a little bit. It's getting a little bit more of the vibrant sugary stone fruits, and it feels more in line with what the coffee is supposed to be. So again, that's kind of my best tip for this coffee. Give it more rest. I unfortunately didn't have the luxury of allowing it more rest, but here we are, and we will go ahead and put up the tasting wheel as well so you can see what we were getting. All right, we have a couple of level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We'll start with the finish. Level 4, yes, even with all that I've said throughout the notes, it doesn't necessarily have an overly long-lasting finish. It actually kind of finishes out relatively nice, given that maybe the tropical fruits aren't overbearing in this cup. I can feel pretty comfortable with it being there at that level 4 mark. Same thing with the sweetness, a lot more on the sugary fruit side of the sweetness, so I like it there at that level 4 mark. Maybe the slightly higher side of the level 4, but that's mostly because those kind of vibrant tropicals were quite strong. Acidity, level 4. Yes, this was a very bright coffee, and there were times I was toning down the brightness, and I don't know if that necessarily did it any justice. I feel like a lot of the listed stone fruits are in those two categories, sweetness as well as brightness, and they were both in quite heavy measure, so I like both of those being at that level 4. Stone fruit, level 4, yes, and they have the listed mango on here. I could see that it is much more of a sugary stone fruit as opposed to any of the other stone fruits, and given that it does come out maybe slightly more artificial, then I definitely like it being there in that category, listed alongside of the mango as opposed to possibly a lot of the other stone fruits. Bunch of level 3s, we'll start with the body, level 3. Yes, I think maybe I was expecting a little bit more body, but given that this still does have a medium body and a fair bit of texture, really kind of liked the texture to contrast the rest of the cup when brewed through the V60. I'm happy with it there at that level 3 mark. Same thing with florality. It does have an interesting floral component. Kind of thinking back, I can't necessarily go into a overly defined profile to that florality, but I was feeling a fair bit of it throughout the duration of this coffee. Berry fruit, level 3. I mentioned there were times during the cool down where it felt like it had that kind of classic Ethiopian berry-like aspect. You know what I'm talking about, that kind of fermenty berry present within the coffee. So I felt comfortable pushing it all the way up to level 3. Same thing with the citrus, as it had a citric quality to the cup as well. So both of those things, while perhaps slightly undefined, I feel like were very much present within the cup, enough to justify that level 3 mark. And then the last thing worth discussing on this tasting wheel is the cleanliness at that level 3 mark. It probably is right there at the level 3, if not lower on that level 3 mark, given that, yes, it didn't have the most clean profile to it. I'm thinking mostly that it had a little bit of fermentiness to it, but most distinctly, something I've been discussing throughout this video is the graininess that was present within the coffee. Yet again, it's one thing if I'm kind of brewing the coffee wrong, but given that I can just kind of open the bag, smell the graininess, grind the beans, smell the graininess, brew the coffee, smell the graininess, I know it's there, and I think that's attributed to the fact that this coffee is just very lightly roasted. So yeah, level 3 mark, I wouldn't push it any higher, that's for sure, but it might, if anything, be on the lower side of that level 3. I think that's about everything worth discussing the tasting wheel. I think it's a pretty good representation of what I got from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I'm not entirely sure where to go with this one because it just kind of has reminded me of a lot of the Ethiopian coffees I have had recently, especially the really light ones that may not necessarily have the sort of clarity I'm looking for. That's just kind of the best thing I can say about this coffee for my personal preference, is that I really love the natural processed Ethiopian coffees when they can reach that level 4 mark for clarity. This one just didn't necessarily have it, and it did skew in a more fruit profile that's not necessarily my preference. So for that reason, it came out as listed. I mean, this is a mangoes and cream sort of coffee, even if it wasn't necessarily my sort of mangoes and cream type of coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do like the brightness, if you do like your very, very light coffees, that's the first direction I want to point you towards. If you like your sugary stone fruits, then that's another thing I would point you towards as well. It did have some additional characteristics in terms of the fruit components too, so you do get a slight bit of fruit complexity as well. And at times there was that kind of vanilla creaminess present within the coffee as well. Still having a fair bit of brightness, nice bit of finish, and a fair bit of sweetness as well. So all of those factors in mind, that would probably be a pretty good fit for this coffee for you. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Talormade, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Mangoes and Cream Natural Processed Ethiopia from Talormade. Thank you for watching.